Welcome to the Wellbeing Podcast, where every episode is a step toward a healthier, happier you. Let's grow, thrive, and shine together. Today, we are going deep on something truly fascinating, the language of feelings. You know, it's funny, we talk about expressing ourselves all the time, but what if our emotions are already speaking and we just haven't learned to listen?
That's a really insightful way to put it. We often treat feelings as these messy things to be controlled, but what if they're actually a sophisticated communication system? Like, what if our anger, joy, sadness, they're all trying to tell us something crucial about our needs and experiences?
Okay, so then how do we even begin to understand this language? It seems so abstract. Is it like, are there actual dictionaries for decoding emotions?
Not dictionaries, exactly, but there are definitely ways to become more fluent in this language. One key is to recognize that feelings aren't just simple labels, like happy or sad. They're more like multifaceted signals with layers of nuance and intensity. Think of it like this. Your heart races. That's a basic physical response. But is it excitement, fear, passion, understanding the why behind the feeling? That's where the real language comes in.
I'm already starting to see how this could be helpful, but I have to admit sometimes I feel like I'm drowning in a sea of emotions. Like happy about this, stressed about that, worried about something else. How do you even begin to parse that out?
Mixed emotions are incredibly common, and honestly a sign of a healthy emotional life. The trick is to pay attention not just to what you're feeling, but how it's showing up. What are the physical sensations, your thoughts, your behavior? It's like putting together a puzzle. Each piece gives you more information.
You know what's really interesting to me? This idea from the source material, that having a specific word for a feeling can actually make it more real, more accessible. They even talk about this Japanese term, mono no aware, which is this bittersweet awareness of life's impermanence. It's like suddenly I have a label for this feeling I've probably had a million times but never quite grasped.
That's a perfect example of how language can shape our understanding of emotions. Think of it like this. Before we had the word computer, we still had machines that processed information. But the concept wasn't as clear. Having a specific term gave us a framework to understand and talk about it. The same goes for feelings. When we can label an emotion, we can start to recognize it, explore it, and even manage it more effectively.
So then does that mean someone who struggles to put their feelings into words is at a disadvantage? The source material actually mentioned a condition called alexithymia, which literally means no words for feelings. That seems like it would make life so much harder.
Absolutely. Alexithymia can present some real challenges. It's not that individuals with alexithymia don't experience emotions, but rather they have difficulty identifying and describing them. Imagine feeling overwhelmed by a wave of sensation, but not having the vocabulary to even understand what's happening, let alone communicate it to someone else.
Okay, so I'm getting that understanding the language of feelings is important. But how do we actually do it? Is there like an emotional Rosetta Stone we can study? What are some practical steps?
Well, becoming fluent in any language takes practice, right? One of the most powerful tools you have is mindfulness. Not just meditation, though, that's helpful too, but really paying attention to your inner experience throughout the day. Notice the physical sensations that accompany different emotions. Is your chest tight? Stomach in knots? Those are clues.
So we're talking about tuning into our bodies as well as our thoughts.
Exactly. Our bodies are constantly sending us signals, and learning to decode those signals is key to understanding our emotional language.
This is making me think about how often we misinterpret each other's emotions. It's like we're speaking different dialects of the same language, and things get lost in translation. Any advice on how to be better listeners when it comes to other people's feelings?
One of the most valuable skills you can develop is active listening. It's about truly focusing on what the other person is saying, both verbally and non-verbally. Ask clarifying questions like, "What was that like for you?" Or, "Help me understand what you're feeling." Resist the urge to jump in with solutions or dismiss their experience.
This reminds me of something from the sources about how the language we use for emotions can actually shape those emotions over time. It's called looping effects. And I have to admit, it kind of blew my mind.
Looping effects are fascinating. Think about it. If we constantly label ourselves as anxious, does that make us more likely to experience anxiety? It's this feedback loop where language and experience are intertwined. One example the source material used was the French Revolution and the rise of sentimentalism.
Can you expand on that a bit? I'm really curious to hear more.
Well, the idea is that the promotion of sentimental language and expression, really emphasizing feeling and sensitivity, may have contributed to a culture of escalating emotions. And this emotional intensity ultimately influenced the course of historical events. It's a powerful example of how language doesn't just describe reality, it can actually help create it.
That's incredible. It makes you wonder what other untranslated emotions might be out there, just waiting for us to find the words for them.
I think that's a beautiful thought and really gets to the heart of why this whole language of feelings matters. It's not just about self awareness, it's about connection, empathy, and understanding each other more deeply.
This deep dive has been so insightful already. I'm eager to keep exploring this topic. But first, a quick word from our sponsors. We'll be right back to continue our conversation about the fascinating world of emotions.
Welcome back to the Wellbeing podcast. Before the break, we were discussing how language can actually shape our emotional experiences. It's a powerful concept, with profound implications for how we understand ourselves and others.
One thing that really struck me was this idea of verbal overshadowing. The source material explained how describing an experience can sometimes impair our memory of it. It seems counterintuitive, almost like thinking too much about our feelings can make them harder to process.
It's a fascinating paradox, isn't it? And it highlights the importance of having a nuanced understanding of how language interacts with our emotional experiences. While it's true that describing an event with limited vocabulary can sometimes hinder our recall, developing a richer emotional vocabulary can actually enhance our understanding and memory.
So it's not about avoiding language altogether, but rather using it skillfully and thoughtfully.
Exactly. Think of it like this. Imagine trying to describe a complex flavor to someone who only has a few basic paste words in their vocabulary. They might say, it's sweet, or it's sour, but they wouldn't be able to capture the subtleties and nuances of the taste. Now imagine a seasoned chef or sommelier with an expansive vocabulary for flavors. They could describe the same taste with incredible precision, highlighting notes and undertones that others might miss entirely.
That's a brilliant analogy. It makes me wonder if developing a richer emotional vocabulary could be like training our emotional taste buds, so to speak.
I love that way of thinking about it. The more words we have to describe our emotions, the more finely tuned our emotional palette becomes. We can start to discern subtle differences in our feelings, which allows us to understand ourselves better and communicate more effectively with others.
This all makes me think about the potential downsides of overly simplistic emotional labels. If we only have a few words to describe a vast range of feelings, are we doing ourselves a disservice?
It's a valid concern. If we rely too heavily on broad labels like happy, sad, or angry, we might miss the nuances of our experience. For example, someone might label themselves as simply sad when they're actually experiencing a complex mix of grief, loneliness, and disappointment. Having more specific labels for these emotions allows us to process them more fully and seek appropriate support.
This brings us back to the concept of looping effects. If we're constantly labeling ourselves with limited terms, could we be reinforcing those emotional patterns?
That's a key question, and it highlights the potential downside of looping effects. While labels can be helpful for understanding and communicating our experiences, they can also become self-fulfilling prophecies. If we identify too strongly with a particular emotional label, we might start to perceive and interpret our experiences through that lens, even when it's no longer accurate.
So it's about finding a balance, using language to understand and process our emotions, but also being mindful of how those labels might influence our perceptions and behavior.
Precisely. And this is where self-awareness becomes crucial. We need to be able to step back and observe our thoughts and feelings without judgment. Ask yourself, is this label truly reflecting my experience, or am I getting caught in a loop?
This is also insightful. It feels like we're starting to unravel the mysteries of this language of feelings. But before we get too carried away, I think it's important to acknowledge that understanding our own emotions is just one piece of the puzzle. We also need to be able to understand the emotions of others, right?
Absolutely. Developing emotional intelligence isn't just about self-awareness. It's about empathy and compassion. It's about being able to step into someone else's shoes and understand their perspective, even if it's different from our own.
So how can we become better at understanding other people's emotions? We've talked about active listening. But are there other tools or techniques we can use?
One powerful technique is something called perspective taking. It involves consciously trying to see the world through the other person's eyes. Ask yourself, What might they be feeling right now? What experiences have shaped their perspective? What might be influencing their behavior?
That makes sense. Instead of judging or jumping to conclusions, we take the time to try and understand where they're coming from.
Exactly. It's about cultivating curiosity and compassion, rather than reacting defensively or dismissively. And this is where the language of feelings becomes even more crucial. When we have a shared vocabulary for emotions, we can communicate more effectively and bridge the gaps in understanding.
This reminds me of a point we touched on earlier, the idea that there might be emotions we experience, but don't have the words for yet. Do you think that's a real possibility? Could there be a whole universe of feelings out there waiting to be discovered?
I absolutely believe that's possible. Language is constantly evolving, and our understanding of the human experience is always expanding. As we become more attuned to the nuances of our inner world, we might discover subtle emotions that have yet to be named or defined.
That's such an exciting thought. It's like we're all pioneers, exploring the uncharted territories of our hearts and minds.
And by sharing our discoveries, by creating a language that honors the complexity of our emotional experience, we can create a more compassionate and understanding world, a world where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued.
This deep dive has been so enriching. I feel like I've gained a whole new perspective on feelings and how they work. But we've covered a lot of ground today. Let's take another quick break, and when we come back, we'll wrap things up and leave you with some final thoughts to ponder. Welcome back to the Wellbeing Podcast. We've been having such a fascinating conversation about the language of feelings, and I feel like we've just scratched the surface.
I agree, it's a vast and complex topic. But even beginning to understand this language can have such a profound impact on our well-being and our relationships.
You know, thinking back on everything we've discussed, one thing that really stands out to me is this idea that our emotions are constantly trying to communicate with us. It's like they're sending us messages, and it's up to us to learn how to receive and interpret them.
That's a great way to put it. And sometimes those messages are subtle, whispered even. Other times they're loud and clear, demanding our attention.
I'm also struck by the idea that our emotional vocabulary can actually shape our experiences. The more nuanced our language for feelings, the richer our understanding of ourselves and others becomes.
Absolutely. And conversely, a limited emotional vocabulary can restrict our ability to process and make sense of our experiences. It's like trying to paint a masterpiece with only a few basic colors.
So for our listeners who are ready to start enriching their emotional vocabulary, where should they begin? Any practical advice?
One simple but powerful practice is to start paying attention to the sensations in your body. When you notice an emotion arising, take a moment to scan your body. What are you feeling physically? Is your heart racing? Stomach clenching? Throat tightening? These physical sensations are often the first clues to understanding what you're feeling.
That's great advice. It's like we're becoming detectives of our own inner world, noticing the subtle clues and piecing together the bigger picture.
Exactly. And as you become more attuned to your physical sensations, you can start to connect those sensations to specific emotions. Maybe you notice that a tightness in your chest always accompanies feelings of anxiety, or warmth in your heart arises when you feel loved and appreciated.
Once we start to recognize these patterns, can we then use language to explore them further?
Absolutely. Journaling can be a wonderful tool for this. Take some time each day to write about your emotional experiences. Don't worry about grammar or perfect sentences. Just let your thoughts and feelings flow onto the page.
So it's about giving ourselves permission to express what we're feeling, even if it's messy or confusing.
Exactly. And as you write, pay attention to the words you use. Are you relying on the same few basic terms? Or are you starting to experiment with more nuanced language?
It's like we're expanding our emotional palette, adding new shades and hues to our understanding of ourselves.
I love that metaphor. And as we expand our emotional vocabulary, we also become better equipped to understand and empathize with others. We can start to see beyond their words and actions and connect with the feelings that are driving their behavior.
This all ties back to the concept of active listening,
Yeah.
really tuning in to what the other person is saying, both verbally and non-verbally.
Yes. Active listening is essential for effective communication and building strong relationships. It's about creating a space where the other person feels heard, seen, and understood.
This deep dive has been so incredibly eye-opening. I feel like I've gained a whole new toolkit for navigating the complex world of feelings.
Remember, understanding the language of feelings is a lifelong journey. There's always more to learn and discover. But by embracing curiosity, practicing self-awareness, and cultivating empathy, we can all become more fluent in this essential language of the human heart.
Thanks for listening to the Wellbeing Podcast. Take care, stay inspired, and see you next time.